What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. The story of the real Pocahontas. The real Pocahontas was nothing like the Pocahontas depicted in popular culture. The history of Pocahontas has been riddled with dramatizations, oversimplifications, and outright lies from the very beginning. And all of that dishonesty only adds to the tragedy that is Pocahontas's true life story. The truth about Pocahontas is infinitely sadder than the bright and cheery, wind color painting version presented in popular culture. Her interactions with English settlers were instead the sort of violent and prejudiced interactions that we've come to expect from that era. Pocahontas herself is still an inspiring and important historical figure, but her actual life story is not a feel-good tale about the common threads between people of different backgrounds. Instead, it's the exact opposite. Pocahontas was kidnapped and held for ransom by the English. Pocahontas's most significant interaction with the English was a lot less friendly than popular culture would have you believe, and it was far more indicative of the real relationship between colonists and Native Americans. Unhappy with Chief Powhatan, a group of English settlers paid a rival Native American group to coerce Pocahontas onto an English ship so that she could be held for ransom. Captain Samuel Argall ordered her capture, and then compensated the Native Americans who helped him with a copper kettle for their troubles. She was born into royalty, kind of. Pocahontas was the daughter of Chief Powhatan, the head of a major alliance of Algonquin-speaking groups, which was one of the largest alliances in North America. The area he represented was known as the Tsenacomica. However, Pocahontas had 26 brothers and sisters to share her status with, so she was far from the only royal child running around Tsenacomica, even if she was reportedly the chief's favorite daughter. The chiefdom did not share its power hereditarily either, so the idea of Pocahontas being royalty is not exactly true. Pocahontas was only one of her names. Pocahontas is the most common name that we know this important historical figure by, but it might actually be the least formal name she held. Pocahontas was a mildly pejorative nickname that translated into something along the lines of spoiled child. She was also known as Mataoka for most of her childhood, and later went by the name of Amanuta. Then, after her conversion to Christianity, she became known as Rebecca, a name she would carry until her death. The John Smith story is likely BS. The tale most commonly told about Pocahontas might not even be a real story at all. Supposedly, Pocahontas saved the English colonist John Smith from execution at the hands of her father, and then the two went on to begin a romantic relationship. Apparently, the love between the two helped the European settlers of Jamestown get along with the Native Americans for a brief period. But some question whether or not Smith was ever in any real danger, whereas others question whether the meeting ever even happened. John Smith earned the reputation of being a bit of an exaggerator, and there's no direct evidence that his interaction with Pocahontas or her father ever occurred. Most sources believe that Pocahontas would have been about 11 years old when the meeting was said to have happened, which is far too young for a romance between the two. John Smith only linked himself to Pocahontas after she became a minor celebrity. John Smith didn't write about his rescue by, or romance with, Pocahontas until more than 15 years after it supposedly happened. What's more, Smith wrote plenty during and about the time period when his adventures with Pocahontas were said to have occurred, but failed to mention her at all. In fact, when Smith did finally write about her, she had already become a celebrity in England, thanks to her marriage to a different Englishman and her subsequent cross-ocean visit, which makes it pretty likely that Smith just crafted a lie to try to cash in on her fame. Pocahontas was tatted up and had a wicked fashion sense. When she hit adulthood at the frighteningly young age of 14, Pocahontas began to turn her eyes toward marriage. During her courting days, she was known to rock a fashionable and alluring one-strapped deerskin dress, which was a real hit with the fellas. She also began to cover her skin in traditional tattoos, making her look like quite the badass. Eventually, Pocahontas would journey to Europe, where she adapted to local fashion with aplomb and sported some pretty bitchin' hats. Pocahontas was already married to a local warrior. If John Smith and Pocahontas did have any sort of romantic relationship, it is certain that they never joined each other in wedded bliss. Pocahontas did get married on 2 occasions in her life, including once at the age of 14 or so to a Native American warrior known as Kokum. Little is known about Kokum, but he appears to have been some sort of military leader and is referred to by some sources as a captain. Others suggest that Kokum was one of Pocahontas's father's bodyguards. The fact that she did not marry a man of high political standing mean that she probably married Kokum for love, but the marriage apparently did not last. She went on a diplomatic mission to avoid war. While held for ransom in Jamestown, Pocahontas became inculcated in European customs, language, and religion. Her forced education made her a convenient diplomat and go-between for the English colonists to use in negotiations with Native Americans. Oddly enough, Pocahontas was sent to her father to defuse the tense situation that had begun with her own kidnapping. Pocahontas won peace by assuring her father that she was happy with the English and would rather stay with them than return home, an act that ultimately prevented more bloodshed between the two groups. Pocahontas became a symbol of peace and religious conversion. Much of the mythology surrounding the story of Pocahontas can clearly be tied to the fact that she became a symbol of peace to the English. The fact that her conversion to Christianity came while she was a prisoner did not dissuade the Europeans from using her as a textbook example of the power of their religion and its ability to bring peace to diverse groups of people. Her assimilation into English culture became an impetus to insist that all Native American people should be converted to Christianity and civilized, by whatever means necessary. Pocahontas gained her real fame by marrying an Englishman. Pocahontas did actually gain worldwide fame and historical notoriety because of a romantic relationship with an Englishman, but it was not John Smith. Rather, Pocahontas met a wealthy widower named John Rolfe during her time in captivity, and the two soon married. Rolfe was coming over to Virginia to farm tobacco, but he lost his wife and child on the journey across the ocean. The two were eventually married on April 5, 1614. And their son, Thomas, was born about a year later. The family lived on Rolfe's tobacco farm for a number of years, and their steady marriage was yet another reason for sustained peace between the colonists and her father's people. This was the first recorded interracial marriage in North American history. Pocahontas went on tour as a curiosity in England. After a few years of marriage, John Rolfe and Pocahontas, then known as Rebecca Rolfe, sailed back to England in 1616. The arrival of a Native American princess was much hyped, and she was described as the daughter of the most powerful prince of the Powhatan Empire of Virginia. She was treated as a curiosity by most, but she was relatively well treated during a whirlwind tour of England. While there, Pocahontas was the guest of honor at some grand balls, attended plays, and even met the king and queen. She also reportedly ran into John Smith, but didn't speak to him, giving further evidence that his story is Bologna. Pocahontas died on her way back to North America. After her whirlwind tour of England in 1616, Rebecca Rolfe was set to return to her home continent in 1617. Sadly, she would not make it back to Virginia, and in fact would not even make it to the ocean. While sailing down the Thames River, Pocahontas fell ill with an unknown sickness, which has been speculated to be pneumonia or dysentery. She and her family were taken ashore at the town of Gravesend, where Pocahontas would die at the age of 21. John Rolfe returned to Virginia alone, having left his also ailing son back in England, and shortly after his arrival, his father-in-law Powhatan also died. The peace that Pocahontas had helped forge then slowly began to unravel. Her son, Thomas Rolfe, became one of the wealthiest men in the New World. Unlike his mother, Thomas Rolfe survived his sickness, and eventually returned to North America, although not for some time. His father, John Rolfe, died in 1622, but Thomas did not return to Virginia until 1635. Although the Powhatan Empire did not consider Thomas for the leadership role vacated by his grandfather, they did grant the son of Pocahontas thousands of acres of land along the James River. Thomas would use this inheritance to become the wealthiest tobacco farmer in the New World, and he also had a daughter, Jane, who ensured that Pocahontas's bloodline would live in for generations to come. The real story of Pocahontas isn't one of singing raccoons and sweeping romances with English explorers under willow trees. It's a dark, complicated, and heartbreaking tale of exploitation, cultural erasure, and colonialism, and it starts with a girl who never asked to become a symbol. Born around 1596, Pocahontas was a member of the Powhatan people, a confederacy of about 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes in what is now Virginia. Her father, Wahunsenkaw, often referred to by his title Chief Powhatan, was the paramount chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, a political and military leader whose influence stretched across thousands of square miles. Pocahontas, whose real name was Amanuta and who was also known privately as Matoka, was a favorite daughter among his dozens of children, and while Western narratives have often painted her as a princess, the Powhatan political structure didn't exactly work like that. Leadership wasn't hereditary in the European sense, and women had their own complex roles in the society, roles which Pocahontas would have participated in as a child growing into adolescence. The name Pocahontas itself wasn't even her birth name, but a nickname that roughly translates to playful one or spoiled child, and while it might sound endearing, the fact that it's the name history remembers her by, while her true name, Matoka, is largely ignored, is an early clue into just how much of her real identity was overwritten by European storytelling. Much of what we know or think we know about Pocahontas begins and ends with John Smith, the English colonist whose dubious tale of being saved from execution by a brave native girl has been romanticized for centuries. According to Smith, he was captured by Powhatan warriors and brought before the chief, who decided to execute him. At the last moment, Pocahontas supposedly threw herself over him and begged her father to spare his life. It's a great story, sure, but it's likely nonsense. For one, Smith didn't even mention this dramatic rescue in his original writings from the time it allegedly occurred. He only brought it up 17 years later, after Pocahontas had already become famous in England and thus a figure worth attaching his name to. Additionally, many historians believe the execution may have actually been a ritual adoption ceremony that Smith misunderstood, assuming it even happened at all. There's no credible evidence that Pocahontas and Smith had a romantic relationship either. In fact, she would have been around 10 to 12 years old at the time, and Smith himself was at least in his late 20s. The idea of a romantic connection is purely the invention of later storytellers, and eventually Disney scriptwriters, who needed a convenient, feel-good narrative of cross-cultural love to slap onto the ugly reality of colonization. But the truth, as is often the case, is far more uncomfortable. The relationship between the Powhatan and the English settlers at Jamestown was uneasy at best and violently hostile at worst. Pocahontas, still just a teenager, would sometimes visit the settlement, possibly delivering food or engaging in ceremonial exchanges meant to encourage peaceful relations, but this didn't mean she was some sort of peace ambassador in the European sense. She was, at most, a child caught between two worlds that were increasingly incompatible. Around 1610, Pocahontas married a Powhatan warrior named Kokum, possibly one of her father's bodyguards or a lower-level chief. And while little is known about the marriage, its existence alone debunks the persistent myth that her true love was an Englishman. But in 1613 everything changed. The English, increasingly frustrated with Chief Powhatan's resistance to their territorial ambitions, concocted a plan to seize his daughter. Captain Samuel Argall orchestrated the kidnapping by bribing a rival tribe with a copper kettle to lure Pocahontas aboard an English ship under false pretenses. She was then taken to Jamestown and held hostage as leverage. The English demanded that Powhatan release English prisoners and return stolen tools and weapons in exchange for his daughter's freedom. When he complied only partially, the English kept Pocahontas in captivity and began the process of forcibly assimilating her into their culture. During her imprisonment, Pocahontas was educated in Christianity, taught English customs, and baptized under the name Rebecca. Whether her conversion was genuine or a means of survival is impossible to say, but given the circumstances, it's hard to see it as anything but coerced. In 1614, Pocahontas married John Rolfe, a wealthy English tobacco farmer. Rolfe himself was a deeply religious man who agonized in letters over marrying a heathen, but ultimately justified it as a missionary act, claiming he wanted to save her soul. Their union, the first recorded interracial marriage in American history, is often framed as a symbol of peace and unity between two cultures, but in reality, it was far more strategic than romantic. The English used the marriage as propaganda, touting it as proof that Native Americans could be civilized. And temporarily, it did result in a fragile peace between the settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy. A year later, Pocahontas gave birth to a son, Thomas Rolfe. Then, in 1616, she and her husband traveled to England with their son, where she was paraded around as a living example of successful colonization. Billed as Princess Rebecca, daughter of the great Powhatan, Pocahontas was presented to English high society not as a person but as proof. She attended banquets, posed for portraits, and even met King James I and Queen Anne. She was, to the English, exotic and fascinating, a flesh-and-blood justification for their colonial ambitions. She was also used to promote the Virginia Company, which hoped that her image might attract investors and settlers. But beneath the surface, there are signs that Pocahontas wasn't entirely at ease. One account describes her encountering John Smith in London and refusing to speak to him, allegedly so overcome with emotion that she turned away. Smith, in his own words, described the meeting as tense and awkward. He claimed that Pocahontas reminded him of the kindness her people had shown him in the past and expressed sorrow that the English had not repaid it. But we don't know her side of the story, and it's likely that by that point, Pocahontas was no longer in control of her own narrative. The English had made her into a symbol, but in doing so, they stripped away her personhood. In 1617, the Rolfes prepared to return to Virginia. But Pocahontas fell ill shortly after boarding a ship on the Thames River. Some speculate that she succumbed to pneumonia or dysentery, while others suggest tuberculosis or even poisoning. Whatever the cause, she was taken ashore at Gravesend, where she died at the tragically young age of 21. Her final words, according to her husband, were, "All must die. 'Tis enough that the child liveth." Her body was buried in an unmarked grave beneath the church in Gravesend, which was later destroyed by fire. Her resting place has never been definitively located. John Rolfe returned to Virginia without her, leaving their young son, Thomas, behind in England to be raised by relatives. Years later, Thomas would reclaim his mother's legacy in a strange way, returning to Virginia, claiming vast swaths of land through his lineage, and becoming one of the wealthiest tobacco planters in the New World. Though he was never considered for leadership within the Powhatan Confederacy, his lineage through Pocahontas granted him a symbolic connection to both worlds. Today, some of the most prominent families in Virginia claim descent from Pocahontas through Thomas, and her image has been appropriated in everything from stamps to statues to children's movies. But that legacy is a double-edged sword. While Pocahontas is undeniably one of the most famous Native American figures in history, the way her story has been twisted and mythologized by generations of white storytellers has turned her into a cultural Rorschach test, used to justify colonization, promote racial harmony, and entertain children, all while glossing over the brutal realities of her short, tragic life. She was not a willing ambassador for European culture, nor was she a peacemaker in the way we often think. She was a young girl stolen from her people, coerced into a new identity, and ultimately used as a pawn in a much larger political and economic game. And yet, despite all this, Pocahontas still resonates because she represents something very real, the resilience and dignity of indigenous people in the face of erasure. Her story, when stripped of the fantasy, reminds us of the cost of empire, the violence of forced assimilation, and the quiet strength of someone who tried to make sense of two clashing worlds. If we're going to remember Pocahontas, we owe it to her to remember her not as a cartoon character or a footnote in colonial history, but as a flesh-and-blood human being who lived, suffered, and died in the shadow of one of history's greatest injustices. Her life was not a fairy tale, but in its own heartbreaking way, it was a testament to survival, identity, and the power of truth in a world that so often prefers myth. In modern surgical procedures, antiseptics help destroy the pathogens that cause infections, sometimes life-threatening ones, from getting into a patient's body. This technique, originally called the antisepsis system, was developed by a 19th-century British physician named Joseph Lister. Lister began to study medicine in 1848. At that time, anesthetics had recently been introduced to surgeries. That made operations pain-free for patients and allowed surgeons to attempt more difficult procedures, but it also increased the risk of patients succumbing to infections such as sepsis or gangrene. And while the doctors recognized the infections, there was no consensus about what caused them or how they spread. The risk of a patient surviving surgery but dying from an infection was so severe that in the 1860s, Lister's contemporary, a prominent British surgeon named Sir James Young Simpson, warned, "A man laid on the operating table in one of our surgical hospitals is exposed to more chance of death than was the English soldier on the field of Waterloo." After gaining experience as a surgeon, Lister ran tests in his home laboratory and established hospital clinical trials in an attempt to discover the cause and nature of surgical infections. In 1864, he learned about Louis Pasteur's germ theory, which speculated that the spread of pathogens in the body could be the cause of infection. Pasteur also suggested that infections could be controlled if the wound was treated with germ-killing chemicals. Lister decided to apply Pasteur's theory to surgical infections. Using carbolic acid, he developed an antiseptic that formed a chemical barrier between the wound and the surroundings. The carbolic acid killed germs on contact, but Lister's work received a mixed response when he published his findings. Many surgeons didn't believe germs caused infections, so they found his antiseptic procedure to be unnecessary. Others thought Lister was claiming carbolic acid was a cure rather than simply a preventive tool. As more surgeries were performed and the infection rate began to drop drastically, Lister's theory started being accepted by surgeons all over the world. He even got royal approval for using carbolic acid during a surgical procedure he performed on Queen Victoria.